Welcome to the Let My People Go webinar. As you've noticed, each month we gather together to really talk about how we can fight human trafficking by loving those most vulnerable. And today we are joined by Chris Lim. Chris is the leader of the Alabama Human Trafficking State Protocols. He's currently working at the University of Alabama, and he's working to really promote collaboration while also awareness of human trafficking. And so, Chris, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me on, and love the work that you're doing in those same areas in terms of collaboration and creating awareness and working with the churches and all of that. It's a great job. Great job.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks. And, you know, for those of us who are uninitiated with how Chris and I know each other, Chris, I feel like we have a very interesting story because I know a lot of people, you know a lot of people, but not many people have I met that it happened in such a strange, almost, well, yeah, a divine way. I'm sitting there, I'm scrolling through Twitter, it's like a Sunday afternoon, and I'm kind of like brain dead, you know, it's one of those days, and I'm just thinking, and I'm like, man, it would be so great to have someone who could come alongside of Let My People Go and help us inform churches as to how to be more trauma informed. And I just had the thought, I don't even think I articulated a prayer. I just had the thought. And then immediately upon having that thought, I get a DM in my inbox. I get this message, and it's from Chris, and it says, hey, I just wrote a book, and the book is called The Heart of a Healer, Trauma-Informed Biblical Counseling. Would you consider reading it? Blew my mind. And I'm like, okay, God, I see something happening here. So I got to get to know this guy, Chris. And so ever since then, Chris and I we've been friends.
You know, it's funny. I guess it's really neat because my memory is terrible. And I know that obviously that happened, and we've even talked about that before. But I forgot like the nuances of that. It was like an immediate thing like that. So that's really cool.
I mean, it was literally half a second after I had the thought. It was I've never experienced anything like that. So I was like, okay, God, I didn't even have to pray that, and you connected me to someone who can help us along this vision.
From your heart to God's ears.
Right? And so one of the things that I loved about this book is you really deal with human trafficking through the lens of trauma. And I think oftentimes when we think about human trafficking, or we think about the awareness of human trafficking or our role in fighting human trafficking, we don't necessarily give trauma the respect it deserves.
Interesting.
And so could you explain kind of how trauma impacts people and how we can recognize trauma?
Yeah. Well, that's interesting. That's an interesting way to look at it too, that we don't give it the respect it deserves, because trauma does impact people comprehensively. So, I mean, it affects how you perceive things. It affects how you respond to things, and even things, meaning like words, music, songs, sounds, conversations with people. It affects you physically and mentally and spiritually, and in all of those ways it can be combined. And so when we see somebody, or we're dealing with somebody that is suffering through trauma, it's a holistic approach that we need to take. And so, and that's why I love what you do too, Raleigh, is that there's a lot of amazing people that are doing work around trauma that are not doing it from a biblical perspective, or not doing it through the church, or as a Christian, as a believer, a follower of Christ. And they are able to provide help, obviously, and support and all of that. But ultimately, nobody can have true healing apart from Christ. And so it being a holistic thing as it approaches us, our solutions need to be holistic as well.
Absolutely. And it's really easy when we approach something like human trafficking to see it from this perspective of immediate rescue. All we need is to go in there and bring people out. But we don't understand that even if we were to use this word, which I feel like it's a loaded word, this word rescue, even if we were to use this word, one, we have to understand that it's not necessarily in our power to rescue someone from their situation. We want to think in terms of, well, I take them from point A to point B. Like their biggest need is that they are exploited. Well, no, that is a massive need, 100%. But there is trauma underlining that needs to be addressed, that they need to heal in. And they're the only person that can take lead in that healing. Last month, we spoke to Steve Corbett. Steve Corbett was one of the co-authors of a book called When Helping Hurts.
Yeah.
And he said something brilliant. He said, we can't empower people, just like we can't restore people. We can't fix people. We can only promote an atmosphere of empowerment, but at the end of the day, it's their choice and it's their journey. We can walk alongside of them and we can be an advocate. We can be a resource. We can be a friend.
Yeah.
But just like they can't heal us, we can't heal them.
Right.
With trauma, oftentimes, because it can be really messy, we as Christians, we see someone who's showing the signs of trauma and we, one, don't recognize it as trauma.
Yeah.
And two, we see someone who's messy and we're like, no. That person has issues. That person has problems. They need to go work it out.
Right.
But we don't know that they are working it out. And that's what it looks like. Like, how can we recognize trauma?
Yeah. As you're talking, I'm thinking that, and you mentioned like that, how rescue is a loaded word. I think trauma is a loaded word too, right? I mean, and so on one hand, we think of trauma as this like thing that's out there that happens to these people that are the unfortunate or less fortunate and all of that. And that's true, but in reality, we're all kind of messed up, and to some degree, trauma affects all of us and has. We were talking before about the difference between acute trauma and in the case of human trafficking, complex trauma and all of that. So I do not want to minimize that, but I think there's a real sense in the whole idea of 2 Corinthians 3, where God allows us to go through difficult things in life so that he can show his compassion on us. And then that informs us or teaches us how to be compassionate towards others. And I think we lose that a lot when we get the savior complex of getting back to your idea of rescuing them. We get this savior complex where we're going back and we're going to save somebody. We're going to rescue somebody and all of that. And it's really coming alongside them and in a sense, really think of it in terms of discipleship or mentoring or just, as Jesus said in the parable of the Good Samaritan, just being a good neighbor, helping somebody out that's in need, and so it doesn't need to be super spiritual or complex or anything like that. And the neat thing is that anybody and everybody can do it, can help somebody walk through the trauma.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And I feel like you've touched on this idea of motivation. Oftentimes, when we come at it from this rescue motif, there's a Messiah complex, whether we know it or not. We're nurturing this Messiah complex that is driving us to fulfill our own brokenness, to make our own insecurities strong. Like we want to prove to ourselves that we matter. And what happens is we end up hurting the people that we're trying to help because it's now all about us. It's about checking a box.
That's right.
And that's one of the reasons with Let My People Go, we push really hard to encourage churches and really anyone we come across with the fact that your motivation matters. And if your motivation is guilt, shame, it's a Messiah complex, if it's anything but the gospel, it will not last. But when we realize that we are loved, that God has shown compassion on us, and he did it for no reason other than Christ was perfect. He lived in our place perfectly, and he died perfectly in our place to represent us before the Father. And now he is at the right hand of the Father, interceding for us as our representative. When we realize that Jesus is our substitute, and that even though we're broken, we are right with God because of Christ, that motivates us to love people, even if we're not going to get anything back from it, even if it's not going to make us look good, even if we're not going to have people chanting our name, we are now free to love people.
Right. Yeah. But Matthew 5:16, right? Let your good works shine in such a way that people see them and glorify your Father who's in heaven, right? And so we could do all these great things and help people, but if the result is them not glorifying God and glorifying us, we're robbing God of his glory. It's just amazing. So when you're also, I think, looking at helping the vulnerable, as you described it, it's also a picture of salvation, because you think of, I think it's Ephesians 3 where it talks about, that you were the outsider, you were the alien, and without representation, and then Christ came and saved us. And so he even uses that as a picture of salvation. And so in a real sense, when we are loving the vulnerable, we're also being a picture of salvation or of God to us and to everybody.
Absolutely. And it's interesting because as we love vulnerable people, as we're kind of showcasing this, it's also going to reveal things in our own life.
Yeah.
I call this the vulnerability mirror. It's going to show us the ugliness that's deep within. And sometimes that's why we avoid people, because we don't want to see our true nakedness. We don't want to see our true brokenness. And how do we, Chris, how do we become aware of our own trauma, our own things that we kind of have experienced but have pushed deep down?
Dang, I don't know that I'm qualified to actually answer that question, but I think a lot of it comes from us realizing that that we aren't God, and kind of what you were talking to, or at least alluding to earlier, that idea that that we're vulnerable and we're messed up, and it's from that place that we can help other people. And so I think that, in terms of like how that works, I don't know, but I know that it does work because, remember when after Cain killed Abel and God comes to him and says, "Hey, where's your brother?" And he's like, "I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper?" And God says something interesting to him. He says, "You know what?" He says, "I noticed that your countenance has fallen." So it's like, I noticed that you're in a bad spot. You're really depressed, you're down, and all of that. If you do not do well, or it's double negative, right? So if you do well, won't your countenance be lifted up? And so I know that when we do the things that God wants us to do, which in what we're talking about today is loving the vulnerable and those around us that are in trauma, God uses that to help restore us as well. So I don't know if that answers the question, but it's just a thought.
No, it really does, because oftentimes we think that we're the answer to people around us, but really they may hold God's answer to our issues.
Yeah.
And so the very person that we think, oh, I'm going to help them, I'm going to do this and that, I'm going to fix what's wrong with them, God's twisted it. He's saying, you know what, actually, no, I'm sending you to that person so that they can help you.
Mm.
And it's interesting, though, because as we are caring for people who've experienced trauma, sometimes we don't know, but like we're being impacted by the trauma around us, and we're experiencing what psychologists call vicarious trauma or secondary trauma.
Yeah.
Could you explain a little about the dangers of secondary trauma and
Yeah.
compassion fatigue?
Yeah, for sure. I think it's Diane Langberg that kind of puts it or says things to the effect of that you can't linger long around people with trauma without it rubbing off on you, you know? And just the whole idea that when you're in a dirty field, your hands are going to get dirty, you know? And there's a lot of things that we need to do to, or at least that we can do, to prepare ourselves before we go into some really difficult work, and then to make sure that we're right as we're going through the work. And so some of that is just is taking before. So like, let's say you want to be involved in your ministry where you're working with homeless people, or you're involved in a ministry with people that are having addiction issues, or with victims of human trafficking or whatever. You need to prepare yourself for that and realize that, you know, I'm beginning to step into some dark work, and dark not because of those people, but dark because that Satan is really working heavily in that area, and is not going to like it that I'm being a light there, and it's going to affect me. So realizing that, getting accountability, and just realizing that you need to walk with other people that can strengthen and support you. It's very much like, you know, with men trying to overcome sexual addictions and different things like that. 2 Timothy 2:2, where he says, you know, flee those things and then pursue righteousness with other, you know, godly men. So getting that accountability and all of that, and then you know, for those of us that are in the work, and people that are, whether it's on a volunteer basis or, you know, it's your paid gig, just realizing that you're going to need to take time, usually daily, if not, you know, weekly, to just kind of step back a minute and let God fill you and work in you and in your mind. Actually, in that wonderful book that you showed, I have some steps in the back there that talk about, hey, here's some things to keep in mind. And so some of it is even, you know, those of us that have been in work for a long time, sometimes you just need to take a vacation, and you need to take a break and really separate yourself from the trauma work, and let God work in your own mind and in your own heart for a while and refresh you before you dive back into the work. So, yeah, so there's a lot of things to consider. And I don't know if that's kind of a rambling answer to your question, but I think, you know, when we go into the work, taking that initial assessment and realizing the work that we're getting into, taking care of yourself as you're going through the work, and then realizing that sometimes you're going to need to step back and take a bit of a sabbatical from the work.
Well, I really like how you put it, because I'm looking at page 115 in your book right now, and it's under the subtitle, Times of Refreshing. And you just say, plan to have quick, simple strategies to refresh your soul. And there's a lot of talk these days about self-care, and some would argue that people are taking it to an illogical extent. But I think there is something really beautiful about self-care, because we can't care for other people if we're not filling our own tank, if we're not caring for ourselves.
Yeah.
And so I really love how you address that here, because for me, when I first started Let My People Go, and I was working with people and I was engaging with people and consistently hearing stories of trauma, consistently walking with people who'd experienced horrible things, talking to family members of people who had experienced severe forms of exploitation, I didn't know that it was really just sticking to my ribs, so to speak. It was really messing me up. And it wasn't until I had some friends who were like, I don't think you're super healthy right now. Like, you need to think through this. You need to process through this. And
Yeah.
yeah, I hit a wall at some point, and then I was encouraged by some people who really loved me to
Yeah.
basically write out a self-care regimen,
Yeah.
get accountability to carry it out. And it's something that I've been doing religiously ever since. And I think that's why I'm still doing the work after
Yeah.
years.
Yeah, that's so important. Like, you're talking about hitting the wall or whatever, but it's really, or you hit the nail on the head before in terms of the not just compassion fatigue or compassion fatigue, or hitting the wall. And
And could you define compassion fatigue for us?
I don't know what the technical definition might be, but it's just when you get to a point where you stop caring about people because you're just frustrated. That's compassion fatigue, and if we do those self-care things on a regular, that will help us. That will mitigate compassion fatigue. But it's still, at some point, you have to take a break. I mean, that's why God instituted rest. That we actually rest. One of the things too, I think, with self-care is a lot of times self-care really becomes something that is actually more destructive, because we call things self-care that are actually harmful to us, or at least not helping us. I'm really down right now, I'm struggling, so I'm going to go have 12 pizzas and 18 cupcakes, and that's my self-care. And so we really need to be mindful. And I love how you're talking about how you're approaching it strategically and really planning it out, because when we try to do those things and we classify those as self-care, it's really just a way of us even suppressing that even more, and it's not taking care of the problems that we need to take care of when we're truly doing self-care. It's masking them, and then they explode to even be bigger problems later.
You mentioned Diane Langberg a few minutes ago, and for those of you who may not know who she is, she's one of the more prominent voices on trauma. She has written that ultimately trauma is the unknown mission field of the 21st century. Like, this is something that God is calling us to engage, but a lot of us are ill-equipped for it. And as we were talking, as I interviewed her for my book that's coming out in February, Vulnerable: Rethinking Human Trafficking, I asked her about self-care. I said, well, how do you do it? How do you process it? And she said, you got to find things that recharge you.
Yeah.
Things that refresh you. She's like, for me, I can listen to classical music and go and walk in the woods. She's like, for me, that recharges me.
Yeah.
And so I try to make it a point to do that, especially when I'm starting to feel stress. It could be something you do every day. It could be something you do once a week. It could be something you do once a month, every 3 months. But if you can create healthy rhythms of rest, it will promote your resiliency.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I would suggest doing all of what you just described. Having those quick little things that allow you to get away, even if it's just for 5 minutes. But then also planning more regular things like monthly or quarterly or whatever. I love that idea of just being super strategic about self-care and not just being reactive about self-care.
Well, as we kind of get ready to kind of land the plane, this series that we've been doing in the webinars has been focused on empowerment. How do we create an atmosphere of empowerment for those that we are seeking to walk alongside? And my question would be, what mistakes do we unknowingly make when we're trying to care for people who've experienced trauma?
Yeah, I would have loved to been. I wasn't listening to your webinar. Was it last week when you were talking with them? But that whole idea of when helping hurts, I think those are things that we need to be aware of. I think this topic that we just finished up on compassion fatigue and vicarious trauma are real things that we need to be aware of. I don't know. We're talking to people that I'm sure have a lot of different occupations and jobs and all of that, but it's not just people that are dealing with victims of human trafficking that need to worry about vicarious trauma. It's nurses and firemen and policemen and pastors and counselors and anybody that's really dealing with people, teachers, and so I think as we're in the church and in our communities, we need to realize that people that are walking through trauma are all around us and they look just like you and I. And then secondly, that probably a lot of the people that we work with and worship with and are in the grocery store with are also going through it just like you and I are going through it. And so I think just the realization of that and realizing that that, as Diane Langberg said, that this is the current mission field. This meaning trauma, working with people in trauma, is the current mission field, because just turn on the news and there's no lack of trauma. Whether it's natural disasters or wars or this human trafficking that we're talking about, or the opioid epidemic, or homelessness, or immigration, or there's no lack of trauma anywhere we go. And so we as the church need to really understand how to walk through these fields with these people, and really probably need to do a better job of just letting the churches learn and understand how to do that.
And what's really great about that is, though years ago there weren't many resources on this sort of thing, there are now. Your book being one of them, but also the writings of Diane Langberg.
Yeah.
My book coming out. These are all, in each of these works, like, we're all trying to wrestle with trauma and say, how can you engage your traumatized neighbor? Because if we want to create an atmosphere of empowerment, we have to actually engage the people around us. And much like ourselves, they don't come to us with puppy dogs and ice cream in hand. Like, life is hard and it impacts us all differently. And we have to be those who will look at people first with love and say, how can we come alongside of you, rather than, you have a problem, you need to fix it, you can't worship with us. We need to look at them and say, God loves you, I love you, and I'm here.
Yeah. And
that is transformational. To someone who's experienced brokenness, that provides healing. Yeah, and so, Chris, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
And I'm really excited to see kind of where this conversation goes, because this is something that any church can engage.
Yeah.
But it's something that does have a cost. And so we have to count the cost as we are doing this. And so we have a couple more conversations to go in this empowerment series. And I really encourage you all to watch them online, to watch them every first Tuesday of the month at 6:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And with that said, thank you all for joining us. And Chris, thank you for sharing with us today.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks.